Good afternoon. I'm Will Hurst, and I'm a very happy sponsor of the Bay Area Book Festival. It's nice to be in the company of people who still read and write. The first thing I'd like to do is introduce our interviewer today. It's Orville Schell, who is currently the director of the Asia Society Center on U.S.-China Relations. He's a senior fellow at the Annenberg School, member of the Council of Foreign Relations, an endless list of prizes and scholarships, author of 15 books. I knew Orville when he was the dean of the UC Graduate School of Journalism, and I also felt that he was a member of a kind of secret society of people who actually wrote the talk of the town for the New Yorker, and this mystery has never been adequately revealed. He's also a Guggenheim Fellow, member of the Overseas Award of the Overseas Press Club, Harvard-Stanford Shorenstein Prize in Asian Journalism. And our special guest today in this session, which is Truth, Lies, and Totalitarianism in Russia and the U.S., sponsored by the Jewish Community Center of the East Bay, is Masha Gessen. Masha is a Russian-American journalist, author herself of many books. An upcoming book called The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia. And of course, Words Will Break Cement, The Passion of Pussy Riot. She is herself a well-known activist and an outspoken critic of both Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. In an extensive 2008 profile of Vladimir Putin for Vanity Fair, she reported that the young Putin had been an aspiring thug and that the backward evolution of Russia had begun within days after his inauguration. I'm also a fan of her writing, and I remember an interview she did with Samantha Bee, and one of the things that inspired me was that her feel for language and the role that language plays in oppression. And I won't create a spoiler, but in this interview she said, Donald Trump has an instinct for doing the kinds of violence to language that are familiar to me from speaking and writing in Russian. He has a particular nose for taking words and phrases that deal with power relationships and turning them into their opposite. You can find that anecdote, but I won't go any further because it has a very nice twist at the end. What else can I say? She is a founder of the Pink Triangle campaign and has written extensively on LGBT rights and is sometimes described as Russia's leading LGBT rights activist. She has also written for the New York Times, the New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, the Washington Post, Vanity Fair, New Statesman, New Republic, Harper's. Please welcome to our stage Orville Schell and Masha Gessen.
Well, thanks, Will, and thanks to all of you for coming, and Masha, thank you for coming to join us today. Let me start by asking you if you were surprised that at this sort of point in history, after this period when we thought the end of history was the triumph of liberal democracy, that we are sort of heading off into a axis of thugocracy, which seems to be sort of the predominant world trend.
Right. Well, I wouldn't include myself in the we who thought it was the end of history. What was it 1990 that Frank Fukuyama wrote that essay? I didn't expect that it was the unraveling was going to be quite as fast and quite as profound as I think we have seen in the last few years. Or maybe more accurately, I think I've developed an understanding, and I actually recall when this happened to me 3 years ago when Russia invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea. I realized that there were things that are not surprising, but are still shocking. So I think that's the state that I've been in for the last couple of years. It's sort of a state of not being surprised, but still being constantly shocked.
So, if we look back at the period, and this book that Masha has written, A Futurist History, it's not out yet, but will be this fall. I mean, it's an amazing sort of tour of Russia since, the Stalin period, sort of a mixture of really interesting history profiles of people and some of her own experiences.
No. There's no first person there. None of my own
No,
experiences.
but you are present. I feel you in this thing is what I mean. Okay. This is not there's a lot of dialogue of other people, but your sentiment is sort of very powerfully present throughout.
I won't argue with that, yes.
Yeah. I think there was this period during the Gorbachev era in Russia, and certainly when Deng Xiaoping came to power in China, when we had this sense that, that things were turning. And I wonder, as you look back on that period in Russia, what were you thinking as Gorbachev was, and your book chronicles all of this, was making these startling changes in terms of glasnost and perestroika, and were you thinking, good, we're off on a new historical sort of interlude, or were you circumspect?
Oh, that's a great question, because I think I had a couple of sort of warring factions inside my brain. I came here came to this country when I was 14 in 1981 with my parents, and my parents' position was very much that since they were convinced that the Soviet Union was going to last forever, they were willing to sort of step off the precipice and try something else because they weren't willing to live out their lives in the Soviet Union. And then really just a few years after we got here, things began to change. First a succession of very, very old secretaries of the Communist Party died, and then Gorbachev came and immediately started saying weird things like we need perestroika, which is restructuring, we need glasnost, which is openness and public accountability. And my parents and sort of their circle, and in part I with them, were convinced that this was very much like the Khrushchev thaw that followed Stalinism, that it was basically an attempt on his part to shore up his own power within the party to make sure that he could rule the country for a long time, and it wasn't going to cause any lasting change. And part of it, I think, was actual experience of living in the Soviet Union, and for my parents, certainly the experience of the illusion and then disillusion of the Khrushchev thaw, which ended abruptly in 1964. But I think part of it was also every emigre's desire to assert that they were right in making the decision to leave, right? So that was one warring faction in my brain, and the other warring faction in my brain was I was a young reporter, and I started going back and writing about the Soviet Union before the Soviet Union collapsed, and writing about some other places in Eastern Europe, and that was incredibly exciting, and it really felt like the change that was happening was profound, that it was a tectonic shift, and that things were never going to be the same, and that really the country, the Soviet sort of project was ending. And that's the narrative that ultimately took hold, that in August 1991, after the failed hardline coup, the Soviet Union finally disintegrated, and a democratic Russia took root. And part of what I'm trying to do with this book is to sort of go back and question whether that narrative is actually correct, and whether it may not be useful to look at those years of change as perhaps a very important but not cardinal shift in Soviet history and certainly in Soviet society.
So, I mean, this is really a question that I find very interesting and very important for our current sort of era, and that is, to what degree does a revolution such as Russia experienced, or China, or North Korea, or whatever sort of totalitarian states have a durability, to what degree is that sort of worked into the genetic makeup of the culture, the body politic, so that in fact it is almost impossible for them to sort of overcome it through something like, or Gorbachev or a Deng Xiaoping, that it's too deep and too durable.
Right. It's interesting. I mean, those are probably not the words I would choose to use because I don't think it's about durability. I don't think it's about something that's become a part of the makeup. I think it's actually about destruction. It's the destruction of the fabric of society. It's the destruction of trust. It's the destruction of language. It's the destruction of the very experience of shared reality, right? And so when you don't have any of those things, how do you even begin to rebuild?
But that is part of the legacy, it seems to me, that makes
Absolutely.
it
Yeah,
very
it's
difficult.
just, yeah, I think we're talking about the same thing, and we're just
wave a wand.
you're talking about sort of a presence, and I'm talking about an absence, and I think those huge absences are what possibly make it impossible for countries to recover. I mean, there are post-Soviet countries that I think have recovered to a remarkable degree, but they had a very different experience of totalitarianism. They could, I'm talking about the Eastern Bloc countries that became part of the Soviet Empire, sort of the outer empire in the wake of World War II. And I think that one of the things that have been hugely useful for them is to be able to other the experience of totalitarianism, to sort of say that they were under occupation, and they had a legacy that they could claim that preceded the occupation. And so they can tell a story about the country that is based on perhaps an imagined but still a memory of trust and cooperation and sort of social connections, right? All the things that totalitarianism destroys. I also think that the fact that they were totalitarian for half as long as the Soviet Union was is very, very important.
I mean, China is now running close to them in terms of the length of the experience of living under a one-party state. When you look around the world today, and you see that there's Duterte in the Philippines, there's Xi Jinping in China, there's Viktor Orban in Hungary, and the litany, Putin, and now we have Erdogan in Turkey, and we have Donald Trump, who's in a certain sense fits right into this historical trend. How do you kind of explain that we've ended up at in this kind of a situation where democracy seems to be increasingly fragile?
Well, I'm trying to write a book about that, so I don't quite have a 5-word answer to it yet. But I think that the premise that I'm working on right now in writing this new book is that there's actually. I'm actually starting the story sort of roughly the same place we just did, which is this imagined end of history, when this dichotomy between the totalitarian communist states and the democratic West seemed to disappear, and we know what happened, or some of what happened to the post-Soviet states. But we haven't really tried to sort of construct a story about what happened to the West once it lost the cautionary tale that the totalitarian states always presented. And I think one of the things that have been lost in the West is this awareness that democracy is not just something to be protected, but also something that's never actually there, right? Democracy is not a definable thing, a definable state that a country achieves. A country is becoming more democratic at any given point or less democratic. And I think a lot of Western countries have been becoming less democratic for many years. This one certainly has. And I think in that sense, Trump is a leap, but it's sort of a leap taken from a running start.
I mean, do you believe history has a direction?
I don't believe history has a direction. I generally believe things are a mess, and I basically subscribe to the mess and idiocy narrative of history.
I mean, I think that sort of it bespeaks of our time too, doesn't it? That it's really hard to believe in almost anything we're just constantly being thrown off balance. So talk a little bit about how you look at the sort of fraternal relation that Trump and Putin seem to have established. I mean, besides just the personal affinity of thug on thug, how do you explain it? And where do you think it's going to go?
Oh, that, yeah. So I think that actually the best explanation for why Trump admires Putin so much is was given by Tim Snyder in the New York Review of Books, not by me, and he said that, and this was last summer, it was almost a year ago. He said that Putin is the person that Trump plays on TV, and I think that's exactly right. Right, he is the ruthless, thuggish dictator that Trump plays on TV, or that Trump was playing on TV. Now he's playing it, playing him in the White House. So I think that, and I think that Putin's political persona and Putin's government corresponds to Trump's basic ideas of what politics is. He thinks that politics is an exercise in raw power. When he talks about Putin, and it's not just Putin, I think he's talked about the North Korean and Chinese leaders in very much the same way.
Even Duterte.
And Duterte, yeah, absolutely. He talks about control.
And Xi Jinping he loves, after having reviled him.
Exactly. But when he sees that expression of raw power, and he sees, he talks about power, he talks about control, and he talks about sort of off-the-scales popularity. And he really does not and couldn't possibly have an understanding of where those things come from, and that you don't have 86% popularity ratings in a situation where there's free media and political competition, right? I mean, that's sort of a degree of autocracy that you measure when you come up with an 86% anything, right? So
it's like a people's republic. It's a dead giveaway.
Exactly. So I think that his admiration for Putin has a simple and sincere origin, which is that that's what he wants to be. He wants to have raw power. He wants to have control over the population, and he wants to be supremely popular. Right? So now, where is this relationship going? And this way, the way you pose the question, we can actually neatly skip over everything else and just go directly from admiration to where this relationship is going. I mean, I'm on record as predicting that would be the shortest honeymoon in history, which I think turned out to be correct. I think it lasted seconds.
And yet it seems the flirtation is not entirely abandoned. I mean, you have Kislyak in the White House, almost as if he's the matchmaker trying to relight the fire.
That sort of thing never works, right? I mean, once it's over.
I really don't, Masha, I have to say. I don't know what works anymore.
You're right. You're right. We don't know, but I think I was just in Moscow actually listening to Russian television, which I always try to do when I'm in a hotel room, and there's real aggrievement coming across the airwaves. There's real sense of betrayal. Like, we thought that he was going to be good to us. We thought he was going to get rid of the sanctions, and none of this has happened. So there's, I think that kind of sentiment is only going to build. I mean, it's not like there's a lot of popular sentiment in Russia. Mostly it's handed down by the Kremlin. But I think the Kremlin has been disappointed in the way that this relationship has gone.
I mean, do you think that Putin and the Kremlin have done a pretty good job at sort of bollocksing things up for us and elsewhere? Do you think their soft power, their propaganda efforts, has it surprised you with its effectiveness or not?
It's a difficult question because it's impossible to measure, right? So your question sort of assumes that we know that their propaganda has been effective.
No, but that they, I would have thought on the face of it, they wouldn't have really a leg to stand on in whether it's RT or invading the American body politic and finding favor. And yet they seem to have surprised the world in being more of a compelling sort of example of their cause than one might have thought.
Right. Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not quite comfortable confirming that because I don't know that we know that that's really what's going on, right? I mean, there's this theory that that the Russian meddling in the election took the form of influencing American public opinion through RT, and that theory seems to me to be full of holes, right? I think that certainly American public opinion was hugely influenced by the New York Times and other major media outlets picking up on the products of Russian hacking. But that's not exactly the same thing as
You think RT is just a waste of money?
I think it's likely RT is just a waste of money. Yeah. I mean, from any sort of measure that we can tell. But on the other hand, there's and I think this is maybe what you're getting at, and I think that's it's very insightful to talk about sort of the undercurrent of a worldview that Trump and Putin and an increasing number of these sort of blunt populists share. And it's the worldview that the world is rotten, that things are really very simple and plain to understand, that everything is for sale, that everybody is corrupt, that everything is transactional. To me, there's been a huge shift in public discourse in the West in the last few years in that direction. Because it used to be we would watch. Or those of us who like to watch that sort of thing or do it for work, would watch Russian officials, Russian businessmen, Russian journalists or so-called Russian journalists, talk to their Western counterparts, whether in Russia or here, and there would always come a point in the conversation when one of them would say, "Oh, come on, just stop pretending. We know this is how the world works. We know that everything is for sale. Why do you pretend that that's not so? Why do you pretend that your elections are more transparent and fair than our elections? Why do you pretend that your newspapers don't do the bidding of their owners and their biggest advertisers?"
So we're all the same, basically.
We're all the same. And so that, 3 or 4 years ago, that still sounded bizarre. And you kind of had to say to them, no, you've got this wrong. Right? That's not how the world works. That's what's changed, right? I mean, we see huge numbers of people in this country and in other Western democracies buying that narrative wholesale.
It's interesting. I think whether it's in Russia or China or whatever authoritarian country one may be in, I often find that if you don't have a transactional motive, making money, dealing in power, you want something. If you are, for instance, some idealistic NGO type, they literally don't get you. They can only imagine you're up to something. And the paranoid sort of authoritarian personality imputes to you motives which you probably don't have, just because in their world they can't imagine anybody that isn't in that sort of transactional world, which I think maybe underlies some of the fundamental distrust of civil society and authoritarian countries.
No, that's exactly right. And when Putin, for example, was faced with mass protests in 2011, 2012, I think he sincerely couldn't make sense of them. Yeah. And his theory of them was that they were paid by the U.S. The protesters were paid by the U.S. State Department and by Hillary Clinton personally, which is because he actually believes that. That's one of the reasons he hates Hillary so much. Yeah. Right? But now we have a president here who looks at protesters and immediately accuses them of being paid professionals, because he can't conceive of people entering politics or really engaging in any activity for any other reason.
I mean, this may be actually the most sort of telling change in the world, that if people who go into politics for public service or to whatever, just to make a difference, as people say, if that is something that is misunderstood or cannot be factored into the equation, then we are in a world where democracy, it seems to me, is tremendously challenged.
I agree, and I think that we have to sort of really dig into what that means and what that necessitates, right? And I think it certainly necessitates something that that even the Democratic Party in this country, or perhaps especially the Democratic Party in this country, has been reluctant to do, right? Which is a language of values, a language of ideals, a sort of a reassertion of those values that many people have come to think of as quaint, yeah, and a little bit embarrassing.
And a little epiphenomenal to the real world of transactions.
Right, right, and but also, if not transactions, if they're not quite so cynical, at least realist. Right.
So here's another question that I like to ask you. Do you think a country, whether it's Russia, China, North Korea, whatever, that doesn't deal in an honest fashion with its history, can't process it in an honest way, it manipulates it, it distorts it, it buries it. Very common occurrences. Do you think it matters? Can a society go on and be successful with that kind of distorted view of the past?
Well, I mean, I think all societies have distorted views of the past, but
some are more distorted.
But some are more distorted than others, absolutely. And I think that's trauma that a society carries. That's a wound that cannot be healed unless it's addressed. And I think that, you know, what we were talking about earlier about some post-Soviet countries that have actually been very successful in sort of mending themselves after totalitarianism. For instance, I mean, my favorite example is Estonia, which I'm convinced is one of the best places in the world. But it has this very, very strong narrative of we are a good people who are under occupation, and we're people who trust one another, and we're under occupation, and many terrible things happen to us. And now we're rebuilding on the basis of trust.
How do you think Germany's done on that account?
I think Germany has done pretty well, but Germany had some unfair advantages. One was that it only had totalitarianism for 13 years. And that had a very, I mean, aside from the obvious, right, that everybody remembered a pre-totalitarian past. Right? There was also something else that short period of totalitarianism guaranteed, which was that people, that you could simplify, I mean, and history is always simplification, right? But you could simplify what had happened by talking about victims, perpetrators, and bystanders. But in a country like the Soviet Union, everyone was a victim, and everyone was a perpetrator, and no one was a bystander. And so to try to tell a coherent and intelligible story about that is quite possibly impossible.
So and how do you jump over that? I mean, this is too true in China as well. I mean, it isn't just the victims; it's the victimizers, and each has an incredible challenge, and is in some way trapped. How does a society, if the time comes to change, to turn, how does it deal with that?
I don't know that it's possible. I don't think we've ever seen a successful example of doing that. I mean, if you can't say that someone else did it to you.
If you did it to yourself.
If you did it to yourself and you have to say, we did this to ourselves, how do you go on? But also, it's not just the how do you go on, but how do you even start to say it? Most people in Russia are extremely reluctant to claim any responsibility for the past, and so what they end up doing is whitewashing the past. And the current narrative is, the dominant narrative is, Stalin was a great leader who turned the Soviet Union into a great power, who won the Second World War, and there were some excesses. Some people suffered, and for that reason, there's also this incredible cult of World War II, because as one of the people in this book says, it shines its light backwards and forwards. It looking backwards, it sort of justifies all the atrocities that preceded World War II, because now you can recast them as having been perpetrated in the name of building a great army. And it shines its light forward because it made the Soviet Union into a great power. And so anything that happened, any violations, any executions, any imprisonments that happened after World War II were in the name of becoming a great power. Right? And so World War II has become the sacred cow of Russian history, and it completely overshadows anything else that happened during the Soviet period.
Yeah, and people like Memorial who seek to dig up the Gulag, Stalin, are erased.
Well, they've been deemed foreign agents. I mean, they're perceived as a hostile inner force. Yeah, cheer is what I bring.
So
everywhere.
listen, if you, I want to call your attention here is this is an interesting article that
More
Masha.
cheer.
What?
More cheer.
So here's a lovely little offering called Autocracy, Rules for Survival that Masha has written. I recommend it to you, although I'm not saying exactly the most elevating article. Tell us what you were trying to do here.
So there's actually a journalistic anecdote that goes with this piece, which is that on election night, I was on standby for the New York Times to write. They were going to do reactions from around the world to the election of Hillary Clinton, and I live in New York, but I was supposed to write about the Russian reaction, and so. So I'm sitting there looking at the returns, and I finally and I started around 1 o'clock in the morning. I started getting panicked messages from friends, email messages that basically said, "What do we do now?" Like somebody who has had to emigrate not once but twice, am an expert in what you do now. Like, how do you effectively fight this thing aside from running away? And by about 1:30, I wrote a note to the editor on duty. And the thing is that the New York Times actually didn't have a plan B. Right? So I think like most of the people had gone home after putting together the Hillary package. And there was somebody fairly junior who was on duty at the paper at 1:30 in the morning, and I wrote saying, I don't think I should be writing about the Russian reaction. I think I should be writing on surviving autocracy, lessons on surviving autocracy. And he wrote back saying, well, maybe we should wait for the final results. That looks pretty final to me, but if you like, I can make it provisional. And he wrote back saying, nah. And so I wrote this piece and I sent it to the New York Review of Books, where it promptly crashed the website several times over. It also killed my smartwatch because there were so many notifications that my smartwatch actually overheated and died. But
this is highly gratifying for
it was
for
highly
a writer.
gratifying
even if the topic's dark. Now, I mean, you basically, what you're saying here, and this is, she's writing this before Trump really got rolling. She says, however well-intentioned this talk assumes that Trump is prepared to find common ground. This is people that say, give him a chance, and, he's our president. And this talk assumes that Trump is prepared to find common ground with his many opponents, respect the institutions of government, and repudiate almost everything that he has stood for during the campaign. In short, it is treating him as normal, as a normal politician. There has until now been little evidence that he can be one. That was very prescient of you, I have to say.
Well, I would say it was realistic. I've actually spent a lot of time thinking about the problem of imagination, right? Because I think that imagination is something that works. I mean, I've thought about it a lot in my Russia work, both sort of the problem of rebuilding when you can't imagine a future is huge. You also, the problem of memory, because you can't imagine the past. But I think also sometimes people can't imagine the present, because what's happening in the present is so awful that it defies the imagination. And so we reach for things that have happened in the past, and we basically substitute our own inability to imagine something for a kind of knowledge. And I think that's been happening a lot over the last year. I remember having conversations with people, in the spring of last year, when it was clear that Trump had the Republican nomination locked up, and people would say, but no, the Republicans aren't going to let him be the nominee. They're going to have a brokered convention or something like that. And I said, well, why? And my friends would say, well, I just can't imagine him becoming the nominee. And I think that the same thing was happening right after the election, right? It was so unimaginable, even though it had already happened, that there was a set of straws that people were grasping at, one of which was he's going to be presidential. So there's going to be a magical transformation. We have no evidence that a magical transformation is possible, not just of Donald Trump, but of anybody, right? But somehow that was easier to imagine than that this person was going to be president. There's also, if you recall, this imagination that the electors were somehow going to step in and save the day, which actually, I think would have been a terrible outcome. It would have been a real, fundamental electoral crisis in this country. But still, right? That's what people were reaching for, instead of imagining the obvious, which was that he had been elected and he would be president.
So, I think it's fair to say that in Russia, like China and other autocratic countries, the checks and balances, such as they are, have not worked very well. How do you think they're working in our country now, as we are confronting a similar kind of a fall?
To be honest, I actually think they're working a little better than I expected. But that just shows how pessimistic I was. But see, this is the thing.
Russian?
My imagination. No, it's just I've spent my entire career thinking about this stuff, right? My first commercial book was about my two grandmothers and how they survived Hitler's war and Stalin's peace, and I've basically been on that role the entire time. I've spent more than a quarter century thinking about the worst moments of humanity, right? And their legacy, and so my imagination, I like to think, is sort of catastrophically trained, and.
What good periods do you see your life as having been through? When you look at your own life, having immigrated twice, coming to this country, and now we have problems. What's the halcyon time that you look to for your fond memories or inspiration?
Oh, I've actually been really lucky. I was a part of, I think, one of the greatest social movements in the history of this country, certainly the last great social movement that created social change, which was the AIDS activist movement. I was lucky enough. I edited gay magazines at the time, so I was right there. I got to write about it and be in it at the same time. It was an amazing way to start a career. I was a teenager when I first started doing that. I got to cover the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was an amazing, exciting time. And even though I think that at the time, I, like most journalists, was caught up in this excitement and unaware of the institutions that survived, right? I think it was one of humanity's finest hours. We saw people trying to sort of nut out what a democracy could be, and people coming out in August 1991 to defend the hope of having a democracy in Russia.
Well, that was the high tide, though, of the dream, wasn't it? We had 1989, the wall, China, Tiananmen Square, Russia falls apart. This
exactly
gave birth to Francis Fukuyama's fevered dreams.
Right. And I think, I mean, I can totally understand why you would think that this was it. This was the apogee of humanity's development. And I mean, I covered the wars in Yugoslavia, which was not a terribly uplifting thing, but then I got to cover the anti-Milosevic revolution in Belgrade, and then the protest movement in Russia in 2011, 2012. So I think all in all, I have many moments I can think back to, and certainly many great people that I have encountered along the way who just are inspiring.
And so when you look back at Russia now, what kind of sentiments arise? I mean, how do you feel about your country of your birth?
Hopeless. I think it's scorched earth. It's just layers and layers of tragedy and awfulness.
Yeah. And do you see I mean, one of the things in China they're always talking about is a rejuvenation. I mean, this is a very dynastic notion. Do you hear any talk in Russia, I mean, besides sort of in the Putin language of rejuvenation? And do you think there's any hope of, what possible scenario by which could Russia be reborn?
Honestly, I don't see a scenario for Russia itself. I think that it's possible that some of I mean, first of all, I think that when there's regime change, and eventually it will happen, I don't think that the Russian Federation, which is basically still sort of a rump empire, I don't think it can stay in its current borders. So I think it's going to be broken up. I think there's a chance that some of the of the breakaway parts of this empire will be able to invent a story for themselves that will take them forward. I mean, this is really grasping at straws, but I think there's a slight chance of that. Other than that, sort of whatever remains of Russia, I think has been too profoundly destroyed. That said, obviously, I still have a lot of friends in Russia, and I think that what has happened for them in the last few years is that they have sort of gone from trying to work and envision a big future, public future. They've really all gone into doing small work, right? So
this is like sort of that period in the 19th century in Russia where people went back to the countryside and to small deeds.
Almost, yeah. This is the theory of small deeds, and it's but they haven't gone back to the countryside. But what they have done is somebody has started a small private orphanage for the kind of kids who are warehoused in Russia. So kids with major special needs, who most of them were nonverbal when they got to this place, and someone else has started a different kind of charity, and someone runs a very sort of small scale education project for grown-ups to try to make up for lacunae in their understanding of the humanities, and it's really the idea of changing people's lives, changing the world one life at a time, and it's also very inspiring, and their successes on that small scale are amazing. It's also in a way having admitted defeat. I mean, these are people who 5-10 years ago would have wanted to change the entire system of Russian orphanages. And foster homes and adoptions and the whole thing, right? And they no longer do that. They no longer live in the big world. They carve out a small space in which they're still able to make a difference.
Let me just see, before we maybe go to questions from you all, let me ask you one final question. Do you think the world is going to really miss the American example as being some sort of a hopeful inspiration if we continue to sort of evolve on the path we're on presently? I mean, do you think that sort of the idea of American democracy, even the somewhat hackneyed idea of the city on the hill has been extinguished and will matter to people around the world?
I guess it depends on what we do, right?
Well, yes. I mean, wherever we are today, it seems to me we're in a state of some compromise. And if you extend that line out, I wonder what the effect will be in a country like Russia, on China, the other big players who have very different political systems and values.
Right. Well, again, I think that right now, what this country has done, it's affirmed the worldview that rules Russia and that I think rules China. You know, that view of the world is basically rotten, right? And that's a fascist worldview. And if we don't succeed in beating that back in this country, if we don't succeed not just in unseating Donald Trump, but as a society returning to this really amazing set of abstract ideals on which this country was founded, then yeah, in sort of in terms of the story, that worldview will have won out.
I mean, when you look around the world, Portugal had Salazar, we had Franco in Spain, Hitler in Germany, Stalin, and on, Mao in China, Mussolini in Italy. We are really, with the exception possibly of Britain, the only society that's dodged the bullet of authoritarianism and even fascism. Do you think there is a sufficient sort of reservoir of resistance in this country to continue to avoid that fall?
So that's the question again. See what kind of history I subscribe to: history as a narrative or history as mess.
Well, just the simple virtues of America, whether it has the innate inner strength to overcome such challenges.
Right. So that's the question of American exceptionalism. Is there something about this country that protects it inherently from that kind of threat? And I don't think any country is protected inherently from that kind of threat, right? And if that protection is not active, if this country is not actually developing in the direction of becoming more democratic, it is susceptible, to that blunt force. And I think, that's my catastrophic imagination. That's my belief that when that thing appears on the horizon, it's going to win. That's why some of the things I've said you've called prescient, but I just I think that force is actually irresistible. That force that oversimplifies, that promises to put all your fears to rest by returning to an imaginary past. That's really difficult to beat back, especially in times of high societal anxiety, which is what we've been living through for the last several years.
Let's have some questions, thoughts from you all. I gather there are microphones roaming around. Let's start right here. Is there a mic close at hand? And then we'll go to you, sir. Yeah, right here. And please introduce yourself. Keep your questions brief so we can get as many in as possible.
Hi. I'll come on the other side. Hi, my name is Heather. Two things. The first is that you mentioned when you were a young reporter, you went around Russia, I think, and you saw examples of things that had improved a lot. I'd be curious to know some of those examples. And secondly, I'm wondering what are the things that the average man on the street points to about Putin that they love, besides big world stuff like day-to-day things that he made better for them?
Right. So I'm not sure what you're referring to when you ask about things that got better for Russian, but let's just stick to one question per person. So I'll just answer the second question. So the average Russian, and it's actually a great question because it gets to something very important. So your average Russian will say that that he or she likes Putin because he's made the country great again. And they do not, in fact, point to things that have improved in their daily lives. And that is very, very important.
It's a little bit like people who support Trump.
Absolutely. And it's and I write about that quite a bit in this book that's coming out in October, because it in the post-Soviet model, it harkens back to Soviet doublethink, right? which worked in a very particular way by basically dividing people's minds into sort of a public consciousness and a private consciousness. And you could have completely contradictory sets of beliefs for your public self and your private self. I'm not saying that the public self is a lying self. I'm just saying, that's your self, but your self is fragmented, and then the public fragment identifies with the state and draws a lot of strength from this identification from the state. It is truly gratifying to identify with a great country. And your private self, at the very same time, is convinced that the government is out to cheat you, that you're always jilted, that you always don't get enough. There's an amazing survey that I cite there that when Russians were asked about whether they thought they made more money or less money than other people who do the same job, 2/3 said that they make less money than other people who do the same job, which is statistically impossible, right? But it goes to a very deeply held belief that you're always being, you've been defrauded in some major way. And so you can have those two beliefs at the same time, and people still do. Putin is somebody that they identify with their public selves, and it's great, and it gives them strength to identify with him. And it doesn't mean that they think that the government has been good to them, or that their lives are good.
I think that's a really interesting way to divide it, and I think we're seeing that more and more in countries, including our own, around the world, that the sort of bifurcation of identity with the strength and the power of the country and not particularly liking the government or feeling it's very just or equitable. Okay, sir.
Thank you. After Nixon resigned, we had a period of reform. And so how can we bring about a glasnost and open criticism of our country today that's constructive and fair, and then reform, perestroika, without getting into the, false equivalencies and the world's rotten? And as George Orwell said in his essays about English exceptionalism, half a loaf of bread is still half a loaf of bread. And as Frank Zappa said, be careful about tearing down the stage too much, because behind it is nothing but brick wall and like a prison cell. And as long as it's a stage, we can still use it. And so how do we criticize the country, address its problems, and get the reform that we need to move forward, and also get him to resign like Nixon? And so
Are you talking about our country or Russia?
This country.
Yeah.
This country.
No, that's a great question. I mean, I think that we have to be really sort of conscientious and intentional at all times. Intentional in the way we use language, intentional in preserving the things that actually form our shared reality that we want to protect, right? And so the kind of talking about this country as rotten and its institutions as fundamentally flawed is probably not a terribly useful thing in terms of criticism. Talking about specific institutions that need to be fundamentally reformed is a useful thing. And using those words, using specific words and acting meaningfully with others to bring about that change is what keeps us, I think, from destroying the thing that we want to protect.
Next year.
This is about the relationship between totalitarianism and religion. Trump has this very sort of weird and somehow paradoxical relationship with the religious right. Can you draw any parallels in his way of dealing with that, and how Putin has co-opted religion in the Russia?
I actually no, and I'll explain why. I mean, in Russia, the Russian Orthodox Church has always served at the pleasure of the state. It's always been a part of the Tsar's mechanism of controlling the country, and then later, weirdly, part of the Bolsheviks' mechanism of controlling the country. And so Putin hasn't invented anything in this arena. He's absorbed some of the rhetoric, and he's worked very well with the church, but basically it's sort of a right hand and a left hand that are attached to the same body, and they cooperate for the most part. I don't think that there are any meaningful parallels with this country in that sense.
Yeah.
A very, very interesting conversation. I was wondering, as a keen observer of the American scene as well as the Russian scene, there aren't other sources for the transactional culture that precisely Trump represents, and this seems to be shared internationally, but it's also peculiarly American. And I would say, that wouldn't it be the corporate entrepreneurial ethos of a mature late capitalist society? And Trump is a capitalist folk hero of sorts, after all. And that would explain a lot as to the sources of his authoritarianism, don't you think, and also this transactional ethos. By the way, a transactional ethos that does not scandalize a lot of Americans. They love the fact that everything is up for grabs. Everything can be, in my opinion, and everything is negotiable. That's one of the fascinating, seductions of Donald Trump in the eyes of many. But I would like to have your sense of what sources here in the United States might be propulsing this kind of transactional authoritarian ethos.
No, I think you're right. It's the sort of the American veneration of simple business-like behavior. But I also think there's a good foundation or a bad foundation for it in politics on both sides of the aisle, right? This idea that we have to be realist, that values-based politics have basically been ceded by the Democratic Party to the Republicans, and even sort of aspirational speech has, for the last 30 years, been on the decline, and much of what we've heard, especially in fact from Democratic politicians, is a much more sophisticated, but basically sort of transactional kind of language.
Just say that the aspirational language has been taken over by the language of entrepreneurialism and innovation and disruption and so on and so forth, which is why I think if Trump should leave, the problem will remain because that deeper ethos will be there, and someone from Silicon Valley will probably step in to fulfill a similar role.
I agree with you. I mean, I think that we need a lot more than to get rid of Trump. We need to get rid of the conditions that made Trump possible. And those go very, very deep.
Hi, I just want to make sure I understood. Did you seem to suggest there was a time in our history of this country when things were okay?
I think it's all relative, isn't it?
I think it is all relevant. I think that there have been different historical periods in this country, and that there have been different vectors of development. And I think that, I certainly do not subscribe to this idea that's prevalent, but clearly not in this audience, which is really refreshing, that Trump just sort of accidentally, or not accidentally, but Russia put him here, and American society was entirely unprepared for him and did nothing to create him. I also don't even subscribe to the idea that we're living now in expectation of some catastrophic event that Trump is going to use to consolidate power. I think that catastrophic event, the American Reichstag fire, happened on September 11th, 2001, right? But at the same time, I certainly think that there have been much better periods in this country's history than the one that we're living through now.
When I look at our history, I think about slavery and Jim Crow, and that wasn't that long ago. I mean, I was around in the 60s working in civil rights, and that's still not working. So
Of course.
I'm just saying that part of what goes on here is we forget all the horrible things that this country has done, and I think we can't forget that.
And yet, finally, I'm sure, Masha, you would agree, there is some fundamental differences between Russian society and the body and system of politics in America, which we also shouldn't forget.
Yes, there are fundamental differences, and I mean, I also I try to be very careful, especially when I talk about Putin and Trump. I try to be very careful to point out something very simple, which is that I'm not, having been a Putin expert doesn't actually make me a Trump expert. They're very, very different, and the countries are very, very different. What covering Putin for 20 years has given me is a set of optics, right? And so I see certain things that we can all see, but they really pop out at me because they're recognizable. And so I can point to something and say, look, pay attention to this.
Yeah, this is what this article is about. I highly recommend it. It's a good roadmap for where we're headed. Where? It is in New York Review of Books. When? It is
November 10th.
November 10th.
16.
Okay. Next.
Hi. I wanted to ask you what you think the impact of Russia interfering in our elections, if you assume that that is there, even though the investigation isn't complete. But what do you speculate is the result or possible results of that?
So I try to be really careful talking about this because I think that, again, the Russia story has served as a real crutch for the imagination, because it works to explain how we got Trump, and it also works to give us hope for getting rid of Trump. I think most likely, the existence of a conspiracy, the possible existence of a conspiracy, is actually still a very bad excuse for conspiracy thinking, right? So one doesn't necessarily exclude the other. I think that the investigation should proceed, but I also think that most likely the investigation is going to produce, first of all, it's going to last a really long time. And it's going to produce a lot of sort of loose ends and connections that maybe weren't conclusive. And ultimately, the dream that everybody has is that it's going to tell us that Donald Trump had an actual arrangement with Russia to help him win the election, and that he followed through on whatever arrangement they made. Well, that would be really out of character for Donald Trump to hold a thought consistently in his head for months and follow through on any promises that he made. Thank you. So I think it's not going to be the magic bullet, and it's not going to be the magic explanation. Which doesn't mean that nothing happened. We know that Russia has been trying to disrupt a number of elections in a number of Western countries for a number of years. There is certainly very good evidence that the hack of the Democratic National Committee, or the two hacks of the Democratic National Committee, were carried out by agents connected to different Russian intelligence services. And then it gets fuzzier, right? Then the theory that's advanced by the intelligence agencies in the joint report that was released in December is that then Russia used that information that they got from the hacks to influence American public opinion. Well, the institutions that actually picked up that information after WikiLeaks released it, and I'm convinced that Julian Assange doesn't have an arrangement with Moscow. Julian Assange has an arrangement with himself to draw attention to himself and to be destructive. And he, if you haven't seen yet the film Risk about Assange, it's very much worth seeing for that, to sort of get a front row seat to observe his motivation and his view of himself in the world. He is his own agent of destruction, and so it makes perfect sense that he released the products of the hacks when he did, because he views himself as an agent of destruction. And then we get into really tricky territory where the New York Times and the Washington Post pick up the information immediately, without discussion, because legally they're in the clear. And there isn't even the ethical question of whether this is the fruit of a poison tree isn't even asked, right? And so, because the explanation that we have is, it was out there. We didn't put it there. Right? So if I can go on and on, but to bring this around, there could actually be good outcomes of all of this. For example, we could finally have a conversation about sort of the media and journalists as political actors, and not as people who seem to have no personality, no opinions, and no position in society. and take things because they're lying there and they're not going to get sued for publishing them. So, maybe we'll luck out on that score.
So I think we have time for one more question, Masha. So let's,
Okay.
a few more. Okay.
Sure. First of all, thank you for your time, Masha. I do have a universe of responses to a number of the things you said tonight, but I'll keep it short. First, I'd like to jump on board with the gentleman who said slavery and other things that we have, but we don't have to look that far in our past. 2005 with Katrina, and the fact that racism today is systemic. Slavery did not go away. It transmogrified. It changed into something else. So there were never any halcyon days for the USA. Second, you referred to totalitarian states. Do totalitarian states invade other countries, or do democratic states invade other countries? Because Russia has not invaded a country under Vladimir Putin. China.
Really?
Yes, really.
Georgia and Ukraine are not countries?
First of all, I'm also a writer. I also have a book, and I also do pretty extensive research. First,
let's cut to a question here.
Okay. How do you question? Russia did not invade Georgia, nor did it invade Ukraine, and I can.
Okay, let's have a comment on that.
I'm not going to dignify that with a comment.
Okay. All right. I think she's exercised her prerogative, so I think we'll have the next question. Next question, please. And I think this should be the last question, possibly.
There's one phenomenon I don't understand, and I'm hoping you'll be able to enlighten me on it. Russian emigres left a totalitarian regime, come to the United States, go to Israel. In both countries, they vote for the most right-wing parties. Can you explain why? I'm just totally baffled.
Not all of them. No, but one of the most mortifying moments after the election for me was looking at the New York City's electoral map and seeing that it was the Russian emigres who, the neighborhoods where Russian emigres live in New York City are the neighborhoods that went for Trump. And a couple of other neighborhoods as well, but all the neighborhoods with a high concentration of Russian emigres. I think the simple answer is you can take a person out of a totalitarian society, and you can't take a totalitarian society out of a person. I think also a more complicated answer, and I actually hope to be writing about this soon, specifically with respect to Israel, is that emigres are dislocated people who arrive traumatized and disconnected. And the assumption that you can, that the societies in which these people arrive absorb them into a political system that responds to their needs is faulty, right? They land alienated. And alienation is one of the biggest threats to democracy. Alienation is what leads people to vote for people like Donald Trump. Right?
You may buy some of Masha's books. I believe in the lobby. She'll be out there to sign them. One on Putin, one on the Boston Marathon bombing, and the third one.
Probably on
the Pussy Riot. Yeah. So please rally outside and join me in thanking Masha
Thank you.
Gessen.